Yeah.
Perfect. Wonderful. All right. Well, perfect. It's wonderful to meet all of you this evening. Thanks for having time to talk with me today and to know a little bit more about spatial journalism. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about this emerging area in the journalism practice that we can see happening globally in these moments. And I'm eager to hear from each of you when we have a chance to do Q&A, what you may be seeing too in your region of the world as well. Today, what I thought I would do is go through, a little bit about myself, and so you can know a little bit more about me. Also talk about spatial journalism and kind of deconstruct it so that way, everyone can have the same understanding of the foundation behind it and how it was created and how it has evolved. And within that lens, talking about specific examples of how we can see this playing out right now in these moments. Followed by talking about some research that I've done that shows exactly how this evolution is going. In addition to the piece that Dev has shared with each of you, I've had a chance to do several other research studies since then that kind of explore other aspects of what's happening in these moments. And then talk a little bit about the future, where things may go, and then leave up time for Q&A. So that was kind of what I had planned for us today. If that sounds good with you, Dev.
Yeah, great. Yeah, sounds fine.
Fantastic. Okay, wonderful. So just a little bit about me. I am here in San Diego at San Diego State University. I'm a professor here in our School of Journalism and Media Studies. I did my PhD in University of Texas in Austin. And prior to doing that, I was a journalist in Chicago and Indianapolis, Indiana, where I had a chance to work in different newsrooms. And at the time, actually do coding of the stories and go out and cover stories and do multimedia reporting at the time. And then also worked for a couple of different interactive media firms too. So I've been in the industry for quite a long time, and it's been really neat to see exactly how things have evolved. I've been looking at digital technology innovations and their impact in the newsroom for almost 20 years, which is, it's crazy to me. It's like time goes by so fast, but that's been my focus in all of the work that I've done over the years of seeing exactly how things have changed for journalists and doing their job, and ultimately how that impacts what the news consumer gets on the end of it, other end of it. I also teach courses in journalism writing and editing and web design, data journalism, mobile journalism, sensor journalism, media entrepreneurship, and of course, spatial journalism too. So depending on the semester, I'll be taking on different classes, whether it's undergraduate or graduate courses. And basically, as it relates to today, as part of my research over those 20 years, one part of this has been looking at this creation that I had of a new theoretical framework called spatial journalism that looks at the intersection between journalism, spatiality, location-based services, and mobile technologies in particular. And so today, of course, I'm going to be talking with you a little bit more about this world of spatial journalism and what potentials there are within that. So I have a couple of questions for you to all think about as we start. So I want to know from you, and you can just think about this, you don't have to answer, but in the past week, have you looked up a restaurant near you to order food or to check out to visit? Maybe you have. Have you used a digital map on your phone to navigate somewhere, perhaps a different area of your city or region that you may want to check out perhaps in the future or perhaps this weekend, depending on what your plans might be? Have you looked up COVID-19 data in your immediate area within the past week to see exactly what might be happening as the pandemic has continued to evolve? Have you looked up a service near you for help? Perhaps, some kind of service that might be related to home or to work in particular. Most likely, you have probably said yes to one of these, most likely, or maybe all of them. And of course, when you think about all four of these, what they have in common is looking at using location-based services and their connection to your place in the moment of where that particular service might be. And so this connects back to the concept of geolocation. And basically geolocation ties into identifying one's location in reference to the location of a specific data point of information. So many of you may not realize that you might be using geolocation on a day-to-day basis or weekly basis, and recognizing that you're using location-based services. It's become so much a part of our day-to-day lives that we may take it for granted in some cases. But it is an area that has evolved over the past 15, 20 years and has evolved quite rapidly. The location-based services industry is really interesting to look at because it ties directly into what we're talking about today with spatial journalism. There was a recent market report that came out that showed that the location-based services industry stood at 20 billion back in 2021, but it's now forecasted to be at 48.5 billion by 2026, which isn't that far from now. And it goes to show exactly how much investment is being poured into this right now. Certainly 5G is being a big part of this to help spur the growth, along with satellite technology and remote sensing. That is also helping to move this very rapidly in the next years to come. Within this realm, we also have a lot of companies and services that are working with indoor and outdoor proximity services. So maybe you might have visited perhaps a store that may be able to track your movements in the store to tell you there's a particular item that you might be interested in that's 2 aisles over. Or perhaps you might be in an airport where it may notify you of a particular restaurant or store that's near you to get information as you're waiting for your flight. These are different examples of indoor proximity services, and outdoor proximity services are also gaining traction within the realm of sports. When folks go for a particular sports game, there may be particular companies and advertisers that want you to buy into perhaps the sports memorabilia and tell you, hey, this is nearby. And so all of this to say is that the indoor and outdoor proximity services are also gaining traction. The other part to this that it's also moving rapidly is within the realm of healthcare and life sciences. As a result of the pandemic, it has actually accelerated this space a lot more now, in which people are recognizing that they want to have healthcare, health and wellness information and data that's near to them or those that they care about within their immediate area. So all of this to say too is that it's having an opportunity for multiple industries and verticals to be in this space. And lastly, the kind of data and analytics that can be gained from the location-based services industry is really fueling what is now a new field that's been around now for several years, but is gaining more traction, which is the location intelligence field. You have several companies now that operate within this space that specifically help to provide location data to a variety of different companies to know exactly what's the foot traffic of a particular given city or area or region. And so all of these point to exactly how much this particular aspect of our world and society is growing rapidly in particular. And so what does this all have to mean? What does this all tie to and connect? Well, ultimately, it connects to these different ways in which we can see how our world is changing, of how we get information, how we get news, how we gain knowledge with the places and spaces that we visit. And so this is something that I have been looking at since I started creating this theoretical framework several years back that looks at how much we can see place-based knowledge forming rapidly in different parts of the world, of course, that tie back to looking at how these geolocation services are being offered, how GIS systems are also playing a role into this in particular, with putting layers of information onto places that can allow for people to see that information for a variety of different reasons, as we just talked about, and being able to make those connections among those layers of data. Furthermore, we can see how this is developing into a form of spatial phenomena. And when I mean spatial phenomena, I'm talking about it more than just a particular block or a street, but it goes into the bigger notions of spaces and places that have meaning for us in our daily lives, and the context that is tied within those spaces and places that may be a particular set of blocks, may be a particular area or region, but may not necessarily tie to an exact address. They exist within this realm of spatiality. And so with this, when we can see the opportunities between spatiality and place-based knowledge, we can see how this new construction of meaning for a community can form. And this can be done through the mechanisms of journalism, particularly through the lens of spatial journalism. And so spatial journalism, just to bring up here, if you hadn't had a chance to see the article that Dev shared with you, is really looking at defining how different kinds of information can incorporate a space, a place, and or location. And that location, again, can be whether it's physical, augmented, or virtual, into the process and practice of journalism. And location in this context can either be relative or it can be an absolute location. So when we think about this, it can certainly be something that is nearby to you within 5 minutes, but it could also be something that is relevant to you based on your family or those that you care about that might be in another city or another part of the world that you also have care about and want to know information and news about that particular area too. That exists within this bigger realm of spatiality in particular. So within this aspect of spatial journalism, it's helpful to kind of know a little bit more details of what does this all represent and how is it broken down. And so what I thought I would do is kind of spend a little bit of time talking about how it actually is set apart from other kinds of ways in which we might see journalism in today's world. So first, of course, it has to be information that's communicated across one or several channels to a group or public. And again, this can be through the mobile device. It could also be through other digital devices like the laptop, desktop, etc., or tablet, for instance. Second, it must be connected to a social meaning via a place, space, or location. And again, this may be physical, augmented, or virtual, which again, when we think from a physical standpoint, we can see, a particular exact address perhaps for a location and how much that particular location, maybe it's a community center that has a lot of different events and initiatives and programs that bring the community together. Could be one demonstration of the information and news that could come out of that space. But certainly you could also have the virtual space in which people who visit a particular location that's in the virtual world still has social meaning because it's allowing for people to come together and share information and knowledge about a given virtual space that they may be in. And then augmented may combine both of these spaces in terms of being able to overlay information when one goes down a particular street block and is able to see additional information related to that particular part of that neighborhood that was from 50 years ago, perhaps, that has new information added onto it. And again, all of this tying back to the meaning and context that it has for the community and for the individual. And lastly, of course, it must be considered a form of journalism in which you must have, either text, video, multimedia, blog post, broadcast, a publication, whichever form of journalism it might be, to demonstrate exactly how this can be considered, again, a form of spatial journalism. Before I go forward, Dev, did you want me to stop for questions for Q&A, or do you want us to wait until the end, just to make sure that if folks want me to go back or reiterate something?
Do you have any questions, guys, so far? It'll be good to go.
Okay, thanks, Dev. Perfect. So once we've identified exactly how does this spatial journalism come to be, we can also then see how it can actually be operationalized. And again, this was featured in the article that Dev shared with you, but I thought I'd bring up specifics about it that tie into how we can actually understand how this is happening. And we can break it down, of course, into a couple of different areas of academic inquiry. We can look at it from the standpoint of the actual content itself and how places and spaces are being communicated in the news content. We can also look at it from the lens of the location itself and how geography, how the different layers of physical, virtual, and augmented aspects are coming to be. And third, we could also look at it within different contexts of the actual practice or operation of journalism. So we can see exactly how people may choose to read about a particular space or place and how they locate that information. What are the behaviors that they engage in that allow for one to see how this is forming? It could also be, again, in the way in which a content analysis or textual analysis could be examined to see how a particular sense of places or spaces in that moment are being interpreted within the community, but also by the news organization. Looking exactly at how the mobile device is playing a role in this, and how is the interface itself also having an impact on how the news and information is being received, as well as how the journalist may be using the device to report with. We can see this also playing out in terms of editorial decisions, in how communities could be defined by journalists and what they decide as newsworthy about one space or place, perhaps over another. And looking at routines, how places to cover as part of a daily beat can be defined and conceptualized in their daily work. Diving further into that, looking at the actual production and aggregation of the news content, as well as the specific layers of attribution, of how specific facts and opinions are also incorporated within this realm. So as you can see, there's a lot of different areas to this that can be explored in different parts of how the news is being constructed, what is being written about or not, what exactly is being presented to the community, and what the community is actually consuming in these moments as well. Oh, I see that there's a question. Would you like me to go ahead and answer that, Dev, or should I share it for later?
No, sure. Go ahead, please. Mariam, sorry,
Okay.
I didn't see the question. Yeah.
Sure. It looks like Miriam, I hope I said that correct. Miriam said, how does metaverse affect journalism or spatial journalism? I think that's a really great question. I think when we look at exactly how the virtual side of this is evolving in these moments, I think there is definitely opportunities for inquiry and exploration to see exactly how things may evolve in this space, and how communities may take to it to use it as a space to exchange information and to have news. Certainly, the metaverse has existed prior to Facebook. Virtual worlds have been around since the 80s. I actually did work in Second Life years ago with training journalists in Second Life on how to do crisis reporting and news gathering. Dev's smiling. And so Second Life at that time, there were several different news organizations that were in Second Life.
Sorry to interview, it's been 15 years since.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's been around for a while, and I think there's different experimentation that's happening in these moments, Miriam. And I think it's definitely one that is part of this space for sure, that we can see that will evolve. I do believe in the coming 10, 20 years from now too as well. So excellent question. Feel free to keep popping those questions in, and I'll take a moment to answer them too. So again, when we think about this, there's different ways in which there can be pathways to understand how spatial journalism is evolving in these moments, and how the different layers can be broken out by content, by location, by routine, by the practice itself as well. And so with that, I thought I would share with you some examples that we can see that are happening now within this lens in particular. And some of these maybe you're familiar with or maybe not, that can give you some insight to see exactly how the space is changing. One to bring up is called LenFest Local Lab. They're part of the LenFest Institute here in the US, out of Philadelphia in particular. And they were created back in 2018 to look at ways in which location could be a particular focus to see how news could be presented, distributed, reported to the community in a different way. And so they ended up having a collaboration with the Philadelphia Inquirer to create a variety of different kinds of innovations at the time. So these are just a couple of the ones here on the screen that you can see. They actually did an app that was called Here, and it allowed for people to see specific news stories as they were walking through the city. And it would pop up on the map to show them that particular story in that particular place. Another example is they ended up doing a restaurant app that allowed for the layers of information about restaurants to be overlaid on top of the map. And so as one was looking to find out, a particular restaurant that they might want to see, they would actually have not only, the basic information about the restaurant, but the reviews about the restaurant and potentially additional information about the restaurant that came from the news organization. Because oftentimes a lot of the news that journalism organizations will put together will often have location, and some of it will be evergreen that can be repurposed in a variety of different ways, just like you can see here through the restaurant app. And so they created a variety of different experiments and innovations. Another one that they had done was a hyperlocal newsletter that focused on specific neighborhood in Philadelphia as well, that not only had news, but also had community events and other relevant items to that particular specific neighborhood in Philadelphia as well. And so again, looking at this as another form in which we can see spatial journalism coming to be. Another example is called Bloom. They're actually a platform that has been a geolocation and location-based platform that was created several years ago. They have formed partnerships with several different newsrooms across the country here in the US. One is BK Reader out of Brooklyn. And then they also have a couple of other news organizations in the Bay Area, Mercury News, as well as the local News Matters out of the Bay Area. And basically what they provide is an opportunity for news organizations to geotag their news content onto a map. So as you can see here, that allows for the news organization to see exactly how their coverage is in a given region or area from the back end, but then also to provide a map, as you see here, to the public, so that they could actually navigate and see what news is happening near to them by interacting with the map and seeing exactly what particular events are coming up or what stories have been covered within that past week or day or two. BK Reader has been using Bloom for several years now, whereas Local News Matters and Mercury News have only been a few, just a couple of years. Bloom actually worked on a project with the Google News Initiative this past year called the Bay Area News Collective, where they brought together 7 different newsrooms to look at using the Bloom platform to explore exactly how geo and spatial approaches could be used in their newsroom, and to really find out how local news could be represented in different parts of the Bay Area in particular. And so this is another example under that lens. Another one is called Factal. Factal was created back in 2018. And Factal serves as a breaking news platform for a variety of different companies and organizations and NGOs around the world, in which they provide proximate and geo alerts for different kinds of news that is happening that impacts those organizations around the world. And so they have also been rapidly growing and evolving since 2018 in this space. And they have, as you see here, a website dashboard as well as a mobile app that their clients and organizations that work with Factal are able to access to see this particular news and information in these moments. It looks like we have another question. Oh, thanks. Miriam posted, thank you. Thank you, Miriam. So as you can see with each of these, there's different aspects to how these kinds of spatial journalism is forming and evolving in different facets. Another one as well to bring up to you is the New York Times. They actually have an R&D unit that is focused on spatial journalism. in which they explore aspects of 3D, photogrammetry, AR, as part of the storytelling process. And so they have a team of people there in New York that are working on different projects and initiatives with their storytelling to explore how spatial journalism is evolving as well. And so again, we can see exactly how, from just this sample of news organizations, how they are looking to understand spatial journalism, how they're using it for distribution, how they're using it for actual reporting, they're using it for storytelling, and they're also using it from the standpoint of analytics to better understand from the back end, what particular locations, spaces, and places are generating specific kinds of news interest and news content in particular. So with that in mind, I thought I would share with you a little bit about the research that I've been doing since the article that Dev shared with you that kind of explores different facets of spatial journalism and how we can see from within the newsroom, but also from the news consumer side, what is happening with this in particular. So just recently, and I'm going to go in reverse order from most recent to least recent in talking with you about some of this research. So one of the most recent pieces came out just during the pandemic of looking at how we can understand spatial journalism from the journalists. My work is very much tied to understanding the practitioner and exactly how they go about doing their work. It's been a big part of my research over the almost 20 years I've been doing research in this area. And so I was really wanting to dive in to understand exactly how do they perceive of location in their community and how they go about covering stories. And so basically through in-depth interviews with 21 journalists and media professionals, this particular study looked at how do journalists identify location and how they use it in their daily work in particular. And so it was very interesting because there was multiple aspects to this. That wasn't just one definition. One, of course, is looking at it as a meaning maker. Many of the journalists identified that being able to know exactly the spaces and places in their community helps them to be able to know exactly what matters to the community, the context by which specific issues or topics really are the ones that they need to focus on. And so they see it ultimately as a meaning maker, a way for them to help understand what's happening in the community, but also at the same time for the community to know a little bit more about what's happening in that particular space. The journalists also identified location as an organizer. They saw it as a way to help them with their actual reporting process that would allow for them to know exactly where are they spending their time, how are they spending their time, and being able to orient their news reporting and storytelling within that lens as an organizer. And then lastly, seeing that location can be a communicative challenge. Many of the journalists in this particular study do use forms of location-based services. In some cases, they were actually geotagging their news content as well. And so for some of them, they felt that in some cases, it was hard to communicate how location could be viewed in this way. Many of them had a very big interest in geography and maps and understanding specific spaces and places around them, where in some cases, others may not have necessarily seen it the same way. And so being able to communicate the importance of why this can be another form of doing journalism was sometimes hard for them to communicate within their own newsroom or to the larger journalism community in that regard. However, from a bigger picture standpoint, one of the things that was really unique from this particular study that I think gets at a particular aspect that can be dived into even more is how much location really connects to truth and legitimacy and community. It ultimately shows how community engagement is shaped and how it evolves over time. Definitely it's dynamic and it's fluid, but it really helps to be the point of where things are happening, and helps to set those aspects of truth and legitimacy that in some cases with journalism in these moments are at risk, right? In some cases, it's hard for journalism to show it's proof of being an important institution. And so that's a big part to this. Second is looking at how much location helps with the filtering and aggregating and synthesizing of information for the reader. Several of the reporters and media professionals from the study said how much having this option to present their news to the reader in this way really helped them, help their readers to understand a particular complex issue more than otherwise. However, at the same time, with this particular study, it also showed how there's still gaps in terms of understanding locative technology and how it can be adopted in the newsroom practice, and how it may evolve as well. I see that there's another question with Darshan about how does spatial journalism deal with data protection and misinformation? That is a really good question, Darshan. And you know what? I'm going to answer it in a few moments because I have a couple of slides that directly tie back to that. So if you want to hold for a couple minutes, I'll address that here in just a moment because that's a really good question. Second, another study that I did as well looked at exactly how we can see spatial journalism playing a role from not within the newsroom, but outside of the newsroom to the actual news consumer. And so this was a study that I did back in 2017, actually it was published in 2018. That was an online survey administered to US adults at the time, and to explore exactly how do they consume news that's proximate to them. And so it was quite interesting because many of them want information close to them that's at the city level. I wanted to find out, does zip code make a difference? Does neighborhood or city block? But in many cases, many of them were looking at the city level to know exactly what was happening. However, within this group though, 31% of them said that they actually like to get news related to a physical location. And where are they getting this particular news and information from? Most of them identified Google as the place where they were getting this information from when they wanted to have something that was near to their physical location. Television news stations, Facebook, and local newspapers came in as the additional aspects. And so it's interesting to note that, and you may find that you've done this perhaps recently where you may have gone into search to say, a particular news topic near me. And near me searches have actually gained traction within the past 4 or 5 years in terms of what people are searching on. Near me tends to be one of the most popular ones with all the other keywords that people type in. So it's not a surprise to see that this potentially is the case too, that people are finding it through search. They're not necessarily going direct to the news organization. And then within that lens, looking at exactly if they have the opportunity to get geolocated news, many of them had said it was by distance, so how far it was for them, by their neighborhood, as well as by time. And so oftentimes when we may think about how news coverage is done about a particular event or situation, we may not think within the lens, journalists may not think within the lens of distance, neighborhood, or time. It may not be considered a paramount aspect to this, but again, it ties into exactly how news consumers, at least in this study, wanted to see exactly how their news could relate to them or those that they care about in particular. And so it creates another different set of layers to understand location for a newsroom, and for them to understand how the community wants to know what's happening nearby to them, what is proximate to their space in particular. And then another study that I had done as well looked at specifically the mobile news apps that exist out there. And many of them have the opportunity to provide news and information. But my question was, are they doing any kind of location-based services to provide news near to the person in particular? And so this study looked at 173 mobile news apps by the top US media outlets at the time. Again, this was in 2018, and looked at, specifically broadcast mobile apps, as well as print and digital only. And it was quite interesting because surprisingly, I thought, well, there will be several in this space that will be operating within this lens and offer up, locative news to their consumers. But surprisingly, broadcast was the one that ended up having the location-based services enabled more than any of the other media outlets, including the digital only ones that are digital native, was a surprising factor. 46.8% had location-based services enabled. Again, which was a surprising statistic, I thought, from doing this study, but it showed exactly how few of them were actually incorporating this approach. And most of them only did it for geolocated traffic and weather. So the opportunity here to think about it from other kinds of news areas like health and business, as well as government, wasn't even part of this. And so that was also a surprising aspect to the study too, to see that basically it was just traffic and weather that they were available to provide geolocated news to their consumers about. And within that space, only 2 news radio stations had actually geolocated their news content according to the spatial journalism criteria. Again, this was back in 2018, so things may have changed since then. Some of these apps may have moved more into this space, but it does capture a moment in time in terms of showing exactly where location-based services were with these particular mobile news apps, and the potential that exists in terms of thinking of it more than just traffic or weather, but into other topics and areas as well. So what does all of this mean, right? What do all of these studies show in terms of the big picture? Well, one is that I think it shows that over these past 5-6 years, there has been an evolution of spatial journalism occurring and the different forms in which it's been happening. However, it's still early. It's still a very nascent area in which there's still early adoption. Newsrooms are taking this on in different fits and starts and different experimentation. But the other side of it is that news consumers are actually seeking and wanting this kind of news experience. They actually do want to know the news that is near to them, proximate to them in a variety of different contexts, and within the realm of those places and spaces that are important to those that they care about as well. And so with that, there's this gap that remains between what the news organizations are able to do, as well as what the news consumer wants. And so with that, there's opportunity for definitely more innovation and experimentation in these moments. So kind of getting back to another layer of this, and this was one of the questions that Darshan had, is the other side of this is that, yes, there's opportunity here. And some newsrooms are taking this on and looking at it from the standpoint of distribution, storytelling, and analytics. However, there are also major concerns and challenges within this space too for location-based services. There have been several different companies over the past several years that have gotten in trouble for having location data breached, or in some cases abused, or making it public that have put other people at risk in particular. And so there's definitely privacy concerns that arise with this in terms of with location data and who has access to it, what is being done to protect the information from potential breaches and abuse. But at the same time, looking at, how surveillance plays into this and who is looking at this location data and why, and in some cases, potentially selling it to location data brokers, for instance. There are also transparency issues that come into play with this in the larger scheme of things, of being, communicative about how one's data is being collected from what they may do on their mobile phone and where they go, and how clear that is. So from a bigger standpoint of the location-based services industry, there's a lot of concern in these moments in terms of how location data is being used. And furthermore, too, getting to the point that Darshan had, where misinformation plays into this as well. certainly there are aspects to this that can be abused within this realm as well. And so on that point, there are ethical approaches needed within the location-based services industry overall more than ever. You may be familiar with some of these aspects of ethical guidelines that are being formed now. GDPR, which has been in place now for a couple of years from the EU, that's looking at making it an option for people to, have rights over what they can opt into or opt out. Here in the state of California, they actually instituted the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, that again gets to levels of allowing for what people can opt in and opt out of, and what they decide how they want their data to be shared or not. And so within this lens, you also have a bigger effort that's happening within the geography space, an effort called Ethical Geo. That is a group that has formed to have a locus charter, as you see here on the bottom right, that helps to be a focal point for the location-based services industry to say, think about exactly how you're using your location data. Why are you using it? How are you going to protect the information, protect the users while still doing the location data services, and having accountability and transparency. And so the Ethical Geo effort has gained several different partners globally to help in this space, but certainly there's a lot more room to grow and expand in this. And so all that to say is that within the journalism lens, there's definitely a need for ethical conversations and guidelines to be forming within the space, because again, spatial journalism is going to continue to evolve. Location data is going to continue to become a bigger part of the news practice, and exactly the ways in which it's used, how it's used, all of these different circumstances should be considered and addressed to prevent any kind of ethical issues in the future as well. So hopefully that helps to answer your question too, Darshan. So with that, I wanted to leave some time for more Q&A, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, what's next? Where are we heading within this realm based on what's been happening so far? First of all, I think, again, there's lots of opportunity that abounds in this space when we think about location and space and place with journalism. It has been considered a part of it for a very long time, the where, the W in the story, but certainly it hasn't been given front and center attention, and front and center attention as it relates to the news consumer and the community, which is a very different lens. It's a flip and it's a different mindset than thinking from the past. Second, I think, again, news consumers are really seeking this kind of experience where and when they get it and seeking it out frequently. There really is an opportunity here that news organizations can dive into, knowing that if they can provide this level of information and these layers of location data and layers of information that ultimately become this place-based knowledge, news consumers will return over and over again to those news organizations that can provide a loyalty base to that news organization and potentially help them to sustain their operations. Third, challenges do remain, right? Just as we were talking about, location data and how it's used and by whom, for which purpose, remains a paramount aspect overall for the location-based services industry, but also how journalism organizations take to this and approach it moving forward. One aspect of this that I think has not yet been fully addressed is looking at how much equity and representation can be explored. In many cases, places and spaces may be invisible, and in many cases, spatial journalism can help make the invisible visible by showing specific areas and regions and places that are important to a community but may not have been looked at or covered or neglected or not covered as much, now have an opportunity to be, and how much that can also be brought to light with this approach. Of course, within this realm too, there can be proactive versus reactive decisions made to right the wrongs of the past and to change the dominant narrative in journalism by looking at exactly how places and spaces could be front and center versus other aspects of how news coverage could form. And lastly, it's really a new and unexplored frontier. There really is a need for more pioneers to occupy this space, aside from the ones I talked about already. I think that there's so much more that can be done. And when we look at the aspects of virtual and augmented too, there's a lot more exciting opportunities within that lens as well. So with that, I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you and any questions that you might have. And thank you for having time to talk with me about this evening. Happy to take any questions that you might have.
Yeah, go ahead, guys. Who wants to go first?
Ma'am, it's not a question per se, but I really like that you covered the part where you talked about ethical policies, like a dire need for them, because in the Indian context, especially, a lot of states here, almost the entire country, we're witnessing a complete shift into a surveillance state. So data breach and data abuse has been rather threatening, especially in the political atmosphere where journalists are kind of under that threat. So I think that was something that was really insightful and kind of helped me understand the part of spatial journalism in the whole thing. So just wanted to point that out. Thank you so much.
That is an excellent point, Vidya. I appreciate you sharing that with me. I think for sure, I think there's a lot of surveillance that happens within this realm. And certainly for the community, for society, for citizens, it's concerning to see how this is happening in different aspects around the world. And I think as well for journalists, because in some cases it's safety concerns as well, right? In terms of if journalists are making their location known and are being tracked too, that creates a whole nother layer to this too, within the space, and exactly how much location is shared and in what forms and in what ways. I think currently I'm working on a couple of ethical studies right now, so they're not yet out, but they kind of dovetail into some of these things that you're bringing up that look at exactly the protection and understanding of those that journalists cover, and knowing that location is something that is a sensitive factor that in some cases doesn't necessarily need to be made public, right? Because of the harm it could bring onto the source or to the community. And certainly something can be located and locative for the effort of storytelling, but in some other aspects may not necessarily be the best thing to do. And so again, I think that's where those ethical concerns come up in terms of really identifying what are the best practices in terms of having when to make locative data about a story, about sources public and otherwise, right? So I think it's a really great point that you brought up, Vidya, and something definitely that I'm currently working on. I can't disclose all the specifics of the studies, but definitely it was within that lens too. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Do keep us in loop with the study and how it's going, because I mean, this is something that I think a lot of us would be interested in. So thank you so much.
Sure, certainly. I'll share it with Dev and he can share it with y'all.
Anybody else?
Hi,
Yes.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I had a question regarding the studies that you conducted when you were talking about location as a meaning maker. I was just curious if you could let us know about some of the challenges you faced in a study like that.
Sure. In terms of access or in terms of, yeah.
Because you wrote, I'm sorry, I'm interjecting. You wrote in the slide about how it helps bringing a community, like it helps in understanding how community engagement is shaped and evolved. So I was curious to know, to go there, to go out to a location and kind of understand this process. What were some of the challenges that you probably encountered, if it's okay, if you could share?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Malavika. Did I say that correct?
Yeah.
Thank you for asking that. I think it's interesting because with the group that I had reached out to, many of them were of the mindset of diving into this kind of approach. They were already doing locative approaches in their storytelling. They were already using maps a lot more than perhaps their colleagues were. They were geotagging their news content. So they were already aware of the ways in which they could do this, but then communicating to others how they could do this approach as well was hard, because in some cases they saw the process as a little bit more arduous in some cases, that it took a lot more time to do, or on top of all the other resources and things that they had to do in their day, it was not easy, right? And so it was a time constraint, resource constraint in some cases for those who couldn't necessarily go this route. I think the other side of it, though, is they realized that by taking this approach, it helped their storytelling, it helped their news gathering and reporting, it helped them to understand their community more. One of the interviews, had said, truth is in actual place, and how much we can see truth in a particular space. And I think that really resonated, because oftentimes we see how truth can be manipulated or twisted. And in many cases, when you have a location, it's difficult to do that. And especially if a community has come to see a particular set of places and spaces as their truth, as their ability to communicate, the importance of news and events there, it does allow for the reporter to have a whole different way of understanding how they cover their community. Some of the news reporters I spoke with had said, in their particular community, there had been segregated areas created in their cities, just by the natural development of how that city came to be and who decided who lives where in the city. And it's always been that way. And of course, things have been changing in those cities in terms of making them less segregated. And so as a result of taking the approach of looking at location and understanding how that layer of segregation has been so entrenched into that community, it has created chances for those dominant narratives of the past to be changed and to really have an opportunity to explore them differently than they have been in the past, because of the way in which cities were formed and how they were segregated by different groups and entities. And by taking the approach of looking at it from the lens of location and really turning it upside down to say, well, this doesn't necessarily need to be the case anymore. And there's more important narratives that need to be told now than ever, aside from the dominant narratives of the past that have been covered in this community over and over. So I think there's challenges there within that, in terms of challenges of wanting to cover those aspects and a newsroom allowing for it, right? But then also recognizing that it's a mindset. It's a mindset shift and change. It's not just about using specific technology or a map, but it's also changing one's mindset of how they approach their news gathering and reporting. So hopefully that helps to answer your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Somebody raises whose hand is
Can I go?
Darshan, is that you again?
Yes, sir. That was my question in the chat.
Thank you.
Hi, Darshan again. Thanks for your questions. So yeah, will spatial journalism bring more entrepreneur journalism in the current media ecosystem? I think for sure. Definitely, when you look at this, because Factal didn't exist prior. Factal was actually breaking news before it became Factal. It was run by Corey Bergman, who then was let go from NBC and then created Factal. So Factal is a brand new digital native company. Loom is also the same thing as well, digital native company. I think we can see that there will be more efforts of this happening globally, in terms of people seeing the opportunities that this can provide. And in some cases, jumping into it more readily, perhaps, than legacy operations might, because they may not have the same resource constraints that a legacy company might, that a digital native company could definitely dive into and do right away in that regard. So for sure, I think there's a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurs to move within this space for sure.
Yeah, I have a question, Amy, if you don't mind. That
Of course.
you mentioned in your article, you mentioned something about the MSNBC's experiment with that my blog next to my blog.
Mhm.
So how did it work?
Yeah, so EveryBlock that was created.
EveryBlock. Yes.
Yeah. So EveryBlock was created several years ago by Adrian Holovati, and he had the idea at the time of breaking down location into smaller pieces and bits, to say that we could look at information, for instance, with crime, and see it on a very, very minute level, block by block. That's the name, EveryBlock. And so he ended up having this organization that he created years ago that looked at it, and it became popular. And people did seek it out in terms of getting information from it. Part of it was tied to crime, and then over time it ended up getting bought by NBC. And then after that, they didn't stick with it as much. I don't know if it's just resources, or timing, or potentially perhaps the business model and money side of it also played into it. And so it ended up, going the way of closing up, which was unfortunate to see that happen. But I think at the same time, there'll be lots of fits and starts in this area. And I think we'll see some entities that will exist, and some that will close, and some that will end up continuing on and surviving. I think it's just part of the ecosystem. But I think the more that there's opportunity for people to explore and experiment with this, there's lessons learned to build on that for the future, to make it better and different than it was in the past. So, yeah.
Yeah, that sounded to me as something far too ahead of time. So,
Yeah.
it's very interesting.
Yeah, certainly. I think Adrian was ahead of his time when he came up with the idea.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So when we talk about location-based services, one of the things that an algorithm basically, so one of the things that comes to my mind is social media, and one of the negative impact of social media would be how it has created echo chambers and silos for all the consumers that are using it. So when we talk about news and location-specific news, do you think we can push our consumers who are consuming news in silos or echo chambers to an extent?
Drishti, your voice was breaking. Can you just type in the chat, please?
Yeah. I'm sorry,
Alright.
Drishti. I heard parts and pieces. I heard social media and location-based services, but I didn't hear the whole thing. I want to make sure I answer your question. I think that's a good point, Dev. If she can put it in the chat, that will help. Because it was breaking up a little bit. As you're writing the question out, I think it is interesting because, social media platforms have had geo a part of them, in some way. Like Twitter used to make it just automatic, where tweets were automatically geotagged. And then Twitter realized that created some privacy concerns. And so they turned that feature to optional so that people didn't have to make their location known when they tweet it out. And so now people have the option, particularly within that space, to make their location known or not. So I think, social media definitely is an evolving space with this as well, to see exactly how location is also forming. When you look at Instagram, for instance, as a platform too, location has also been a part of Instagram. And it has been a big part of the discovery of what people see in Instagram based on location as well. Snapchat, for sure is definitely tied within location. You know, the map is still a part of their platform, and how people share where they may be and what they're doing in that particular place. So I think that's another aspect to it. And I see that you posted your question. So can location-based news put news consumers in silos? Certainly, I think there is opportunity for that to happen. And opportunity in the sense that, yes, it can happen. Is it a good thing? No, right? I think that people will seek out the news that they feel agrees with them, that they feel agrees with their perspective. And certainly I think that will exist with whatever forms of journalism exist moving forward. I think the challenge that journalists have is trying to break through those silos to show how much other, within the context of spatial journalism, how much other spaces and places are of importance, aside from the one that may impact them personally or those that they care about. And I think being able to find ways by which to provide that is an important aspect to this. But certainly it can happen. And I think it's something, again, that also has to be considered part of those ethical guidelines as well, right? Aside from location data itself too, is thinking about exactly how the silos can be created and how to identify best practices that could prevent that from happening. Ideally, it won't completely, but there may be ways by which to help address it in some cases. So it's an excellent question. I hope I helped answer it a little bit for you, Justine.
Sir, you are on mute.
Yeah, anybody else? Anybody else has any questions? Any more questions? All right, thank you so much, guys, for being here. Amy, it's been an honor to have you around. This is
Thank you for
something.
inviting me. And
Yeah.
so late too. I appreciate you all being up so late for me.
Yeah, it's been a very long day. It's very long day indeed. Thank you. So would you mind sharing your presentation with me, and so that I can share with them?
Of course, we'll do. I'll send it over to you, and be wonderful to be in touch with you all.
Yeah, and your email. I have your email, of course. Some of them might want to get back to you about something if they are interested. So they've been talking
Of course.
about.
Sounds
Okay.
good. And hopefully maybe someday I can see some of you in person.
Do drop by in Chennai. South, yeah. When you're
All
in
right,
this
take
part
care,
of the world.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night. Take
Yeah.
care, everyone.
Thank
You
you,
have
sir.
a nice day. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.